Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, where we take an in-depth look at how news from around the world is impacting Taiwan. I'm your host, Bing Wang. According to Stop AAPI Hates, from March 2020, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, to now, there have been 11,000 acts of hate against Asian Americans in the United States. That means 1 out of every 500 Asian Americans could have been the target of a hate crime in the last 3 years. To discuss the wider implications behind the situation, we're joined by Stephanie Chang, a scholar of Asian American Studies. So Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Why are we seeing such an uptick in Asian American hate crimes?
You know, that's a complicated question, but I think a lot of it can be traced to certainly the COVID pandemic, especially the start of and sort of the apex of the pandemic itself in the past couple of years. Historically speaking, I think people of color and Asian Americans have always been sort of read as diseased people or associated with disease, and there was no difference when it came to the COVID pandemic as well. And I think in a moment of vulnerability and fear and a lot of public fear mongering by a lot of different sort of sources, I think the blame fell onto the shoulders of Asian Americans, which then kind of created situations where violence was then implicated against Asian Americans.
Let's take a look at history. What other similar events in history caused a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans?
To answer this question would be to actually just sort of address that Asian people coming to the United States, settling in the United States and making communities in the United States, that whole process, quite frankly, is sort of shaped through violence in a lot of ways already. And so because of this, there's a lot of ways in which historically we can see how sort of violence being directed towards Asian Americans. And so some factors may include something as geopolitically broad like war. So really clear example would be during World War II, Japanese Americans were incarcerated because they were blamed for what was happening broadly across the world and specifically the war. We can also see this after 9/11, which again, very broad sort of geopolitical happenings like war, also creating moments of extreme violence towards the Middle Eastern, Arab, and South Asian communities, particularly here in the United States and I think Canada as well. But we can also think about moments in which Asian Americans were blamed for quote unquote taking jobs, wherein things like the Chinese Exclusion Act were passed, or things as tragic and horrific as the murder of Vincent Chin in the 80s due to him being sort of believed to be Japanese, even though he wasn't, as a lot of people were blaming Japanese folks for the loss of jobs, particularly in the auto industry at that time. And so definitely I think examining Asian American history, you can see how this is the case. It spans throughout both time and space.
Yeah, so you talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. How did that lead to the Yellow Peril, and what is the Yellow Peril?
Yeah, so I think Yellow Peril actually kind of existed even before the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was a lot of it, that sort of sentiment of Yellow Peril is what kind of led to the exclusion of Chinese immigrants to the US. And so Yellow Peril sort of describes a sort of a fear directed towards Asian people and Asian bodies, a sense of peril, so to speak, right? There's a fear of their foreignness, a fear of how they're strange, how they're different, how they don't fit with the white majority. And subsequently, not only do they not belong, but there's a need to get them out. And so Yellow Peril, again, is sort of describing this xenophobic reaction towards, in particular, Asian people that were coming over in the 1800s, which again then led to the Exclusion Act, and which has also continued to manifest in places like the United States as immigration from Asia continues through sort of different waves.
And I think that's happening right now again with the US and China tensions. But you also mentioned Vincent Chin, and I want to talk about what the killers said before Vincent Chin was murdered. He said, "It's because of you, MFers, that we're out of work." So clearly there was some discrimination there. And the two people that murdered him, all they got was 3 years probation and $3,000 fine. So some people say it's not enough. Some people say the punishment needs to fit the person and not the crime.
I mean, what happened with Vincent Chin was extraordinarily tragic and definitely revealed the extraordinary contradictions and gaps and failures that basically permeate and make up the American justice system, and sort of pointed to the ways in which that it doesn't work and that it's also extraordinarily racist. And so it revealed how, or even though, the evidence is extremely clear that this murder was committed solely because of hate and also misplaced blame, that, so to speak, the punishment didn't fit the crime. I think what's important to take away is not necessarily this idea, though, that we should rally for a harsher punishment, a harsher criminal justice system, but rather it's very much so revealing of, again, the failure of these American systems that are essentially hinged on and predicated upon white supremacy.
So you mentioned white supremacy. What is white supremacy?
To sort of put it simply, so to speak, we can think about it as kind of the foundational racial ideology or sort of racial belief of sort of the United States, wherein it positions whiteness and people who fall under the category of whiteness into a position of power. Who is defined as white and who falls in the category of white is something that is been very complicated, is very complicated, and something that has been fluid over the centuries of which it has existed. But essentially it does point to institutions and structures that uphold this idea and belief that whiteness is the thing in power, and anybody who isn't articulated as white is subsequently lesser than, So, yeah.
And why should Taiwanese people care about anti-Asian hate?
These moments of anti-Asian hate, I think, are really sobering examples of how deeply, again, things like white supremacy, how racism runs deep in our societies and our global society. And I think oftentimes Asian people, which obviously includes like Taiwanese people, Taiwanese Americans, it's tempting to buy into discourses that we're going to be okay, we're not going to be attacked, we're not going to be treated as foreigners, people are not going to commit racism to us as long as we follow and abide by a certain set of rules. But I think, as what these hate crimes have shown, that that's not the case, right? It doesn't protect us to sort of have a blind eye towards racism. It doesn't behoove us to not sort of understand the broader systemic implications of these things happening. So I think it's really important to sort of make the connection between systemic racism, white supremacy, and also these hate crimes happening. Those are a very distinct connection. And so for Taiwanese folks, I think that's, for me, the most important thing to hold on to and understand when sort of processing these tragedies and these violences.
So Stephanie, thank you for all of that. I reached out to you last year about the same topic. It was the last day of Asian American Heritage Month. And BTS was invited to the White House to raise awareness of issues affecting Asian Americans. Here's what they said.
최근 아시아계를 대상으로 한 많은 증오 범죄에 굉장히 놀랍고 또 마음이 안 좋았는데요. 이런 일이 근절되는데 조금이라도 도움이 되고자 오늘 이 자리를 빌어 목소리를 내고자 합니다.
According to the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, anti-Asian hate crimes have increased by 339% since the start of the pandemic.
When racialized violence is directed towards Asian Americans, it's people are not discerning, right? They read our bodies as the same cross community. They're not interested in actually identifying who isn't and who is Chinese. It's specifically interested in committing racial violence.
The U.S. government has taken steps to tackle the rise in violence against Asians, such as providing grants to local governments to respond to hate crimes and expanding public education campaigns. The White House has even invited Asian American activists throughout May to work on solutions. And hopefully, spotlighting the world's most popular boy band will help raise awareness even further. So Stephanie, that was last year. We just saw the White House make a big show of inviting superstar BTS and other activists. Did any dynamite changes come out of this? Did the government do anything else?
So I think specifically BTS themselves have gone on to different things and also different, endeavors and things like that. So I think specifically, though, the Biden administration, I haven't really seen much significant change being made to address what was discussed at that sort of gathering or press conference. If anything, I think that if you take a look at legislation that has been passed in the past year here in the U.S., we can actually see how legislation has been used against a lot of marginalized people, people of color, people who give birth, queer and trans folks. I mean, if you actually just really take a look at legislation and how it's been being passed in the U.S., you can tell how this country is like really struggling in a lot of ways. So, not much significant change in that regard after that happened, in my opinion.
So only 1 in 5 Asian Americans actually reported their discrimination. Why is that? And is it because of a lack of trust in the government?
I think part of it, I wonder if it is certainly distrust, because as we talked about in terms of Vincent Chin, clearly the criminal justice system has failed in so many ways. And it's, again, hinged to things like anti-Blackness. It very much so harms, less so helps, if that makes any sense. And I also think a lot of times people individualize when this stuff happens, where they go, oh, it was just a sort of one-off, or I did something. There's sort of internalized blame that happens as well. That also encourages people to sort of process what happens to them in ways that doesn't move them to kind of discuss it or bring it up publicly with like community or like reporting it, so to speak. But I think it's also important as well that, I think folks are also envisioning ways of thinking about community accountability that doesn't necessarily also means like reporting to police. I think people are also making calls for saying, to address these issues, it's not necessarily a matter of increasing police presence or increasing policing or surveillance or making the criminal justice system stronger, but it's actually about investing in communities and building up communities, right?
So Stephanie, what structural changes need to be made?
I think I definitely am sort of on the side of folks who are sort of envisioning it, again, more as a sort of community response and sort of investing in communities. So what does that mean? That means not necessarily taking money and then putting it towards, again, the criminal justice system or what folks call the carceral system, but thinking about, putting it towards policies, towards housing, towards food justice, towards healthcare, towards education and things like that, which have been actually proven to actually decrease rates of crime than things like building more prisons, for instance. Another sort of really important thing that needs to continue and happen is increasing solidarity building within communities. And a lot of people are already doing this. There's a lot of organizations that are working through this question. But I think sometimes, especially what we've seen, I think, in discourses around anti-Asian hate crimes is that there's a lot of blame put on different communities of color. So I think in these kind of moments, it's important to push back and not uphold that, and instead think about building solidarity with one another instead.
Anything else you want to add? Anything you think is missing from the conversation that we had?
I think there's, again, the important takeaway is, I think, just when we think about anti-Asian hate crimes, it's important, first of all, to think about it systemically, tied to things like white supremacy, and that the response should be more, I think, community-driven and also solidarity building in terms of building communities up and linking up communities rather than breaking them apart and upholding problematic structures of power.
Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us on the show. We really learned so much from you, and thank you so much.
Of course, it was my pleasure.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out, where you can find more stories on TaiwanPlus on Facebook and on Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.